Let's now speak to Laura Blumenfeld. She's a senior fellow at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, a best-selling author and Middle East analyst in Washington, D.C. Laura, what's next for Hezbollah after Nasrallah's death?
Well, look, this is a game changer, but it isn't game over. I mean, after all, Israel took out the man, but not the missiles. They still have a potent arsenal, precision-guided missiles aimed at Israeli population centers. I mean, this was the storehouse of weapons that kept Israeli military leaders up at night for the past decade with night sweats. It wasn't Hamas, it was Hezbollah. So if they have some kind of succession in place, they still can really present a deadly threat to Israel. The question is who's standing and who's willing to lead, given the short lifespan for their leaders.
So let's get this straight. You're essentially saying that Hezbollah can continue to operate and attack Israel even after its leader and many top commanders are gone and still do damage to the nation.
They certainly have the capability, and the IDF spokesman stood before his people in the world and said, look, this isn't over. We have two goals before this fight is finished. Number one is to bring our hostages home, and number two is to secure our borders, which means bringing the people back, the 60,000 Israeli civilians who've been displaced along that northern border. Israel's country has shrunk, significantly over the past 11 months, not necessarily because there had been a fight in the north, but because there had been a war of attrition. So I think Israel's goal really is to kind of borrow a phrase from Hobbes, which is to go nasty, brutish, and short, go hard and try to wipe out Hezbollah so that they can bring the people back to the north.
Let's cast our gaze into a possible future. Many observers we've spoken to believe Israel would have a hard time invading Lebanon due to Hezbollah's strategic advantage on the ground. Still, to some, a ground offensive is imminent. Do you think Israel will go ahead with it?
Absolutely. Look, they've learned that awful lesson, that hard lesson in 1982 and to a certain extent in 2006. Lebanon in the Israeli consciousness is sort of like Vietnam in the United States. It's synonymous with a kind of a long, miserable slog, which ultimately, at best, was a draw, but perhaps even a loss. So I think they'd like to avoid that ground war. On the other hand, they do believe that by threatening and mobilizing the potential for a ground war, that's what's going to bring them eventually around to peace, what they consider a kind of once and for all peace, rather than fighting this war every maybe 6 months, 2 or 3 years. This might buy them at best. Again, this is a very sad and cynical view, but perhaps realistic. It might get them another 10 years.
The occasional viewer might believe that there's not a war in Gaza right now, but of course there is. Where do the latest developments leave the war in Gaza?
Well, we might have missed the announcement because there's so many headlines flying yesterday, but the IDF has declared sort of semi-victory. We've defeated Hamas in Gaza. So that is a good thing for those of us who are pushing for a ceasefire, from the United States. We are pushing for a diplomatic solution. So if Netanyahu can claim victory in Gaza, that's a good sign. The other thing that's important to remember is that Israel was surprised on October 7th. It was not only an operational disaster and embarrassment, but it was an intelligence failure. These precision strikes on leaders like Hassan Nasrallah, or before that, Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas's leader who was visiting Iran, that's a way of reestablishing Israel's superiority on the intelligence point of view, which again establishes deterrence. So all of those kind of wins, what Israel would consider a win, and reestablishing strength, delivering the first blow, going back to what's their playbook, which is preemptive strikes, does bring us some momentum and hope that we can reach a ceasefire.
I want to talk about Iran just for a moment. It has called the latest attacks on Lebanon by Israel short-sighted and called for a united front by its proxies. Does Iran have a strategy at this point after both Hamas and Hezbollah have sustained significant blows?
Iran has a strategy. It is a long-term strategy. They have a clock ticking down backwards in Palestine Square in Tehran to 2040, which is a doomsday clock for the end of Israel. They are playing the long game. They prefer a war of attrition. That's why Israel is pushing really hard to go fast and furious. Israel calls Iran an octopus with 8 arms, right, sort of encircling Israel. Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah are sort of the right arm that Israel has just blown off. So when we asking what will Iran do next, I think the most important question to ask on top of that is what will the United States do next? That's who they fear. Iran, the president just stood at the UN in New York and talked about opening up relations or warming relations with the West if the United States, parks their battleships outside of Iran in the waters there and sort of shows a real force of strength and power. I think that maybe we can do what we've always done in the past, 11 months, which is that one word don't of deterrence.
Laura Blumenfeld, Middle East analyst in Washington, D.C. Many, many thanks for your time and your perspective.